The year was 1847. Kentucky's hills rolled endlessly, blanketed in a shroud of morning mist. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wild honeysuckle, and the cries of distant hawks drifted over the valley. Millbrook was barely more than a name on a hand-drawn map, just a dirt track worn by wagon wheels, a blacksmith's forge that rang like a church bell at dawn, and a scattering of rough-hewn cabins crouched beside a winding creek. Into this raw wilderness came two women, Sisters Margaret and Eliza Cunningham. They were not timid souls. Daughters of a stern but kind Scottish preacher, they had sailed across the Atlantic with little more than a few trunks of clothing, a family Bible, and a fierce belief in building something better. Their father had dreamed of the New World, but fate had claimed him during the harsh winter of 1846, leaving the sisters to carve their own path. They chose Millbrook, not because it was easy, but because it was untouched. A place where hope could still be planted in wild soil. With their own hands, and with the help of a few neighboring farmers, the Cunninghams raised the Millbrook Rest, a wide, welcoming wooden lodge with whitewashed walls, a porch that wrapped around like an open arm, and a stone hearth inside that never went cold. Margaret was the heart of the kitchen, baking loaves of bread whose smell could tempt even the most weary traveler. Eliza tended the common room, pouring coffee, playing the old upright piano they had hauled in from Lexington, and listening to the stories of strangers. To those heading west, chasing gold or greener pastures, Millbrook Rest was a beacon in the dark. It offered more than food and lodging, it offered humanity. There was laughter here, the sound of boots tapping to fiddle tunes, and the comfort of voices reading scripture or telling tall tales by firelight. But there was something else, something unspoken, an understanding that not all travelers reached their destination. The frontier was beautiful, but it was not gentle. Harsh winters, sudden fevers, accidents on the trail, death walked the same roads as life. When tragedy struck a traveler passing through, the sisters refused to send the body along the road in a rough pine box. Instead, they offered the small meadow behind the inn as a resting place. Margaret would sew burial shrouds from her own cloth. Eliza would carve simple wooden markers, each one bearing a name. If a name was known, the graves began as 1, then 3, then 7. Each one was tended as if it belonged to family. And slowly, word spread, not just of warm beds and good food, but of the kindness of the Cunningham sisters, who gave dignity to those who would otherwise have been forgotten. By the winter of 1849, the meadow held 17 graves. By 1853, there were 30. And by the time the sisters themselves were old and gray, the count had reached 43. 43 lives, each with a story that ended in Millbrook. Locals began to call it the 43, speaking of it with reverence. Some swore the meadow was peaceful in a way that made you pause, as though the dead themselves were grateful. Others whispered of strange lights at night, or of voices carried on the wind. The sisters never spoke of such things. They only kept tending the meadow, year after year. In the journals Margaret left behind, she wrote one sentence that still survives today. "We could not save them all, but we could love them until the end." The Millbrook Rest still stands, or so they say, though the paint has faded and the porch boards creak. The meadow behind it still holds the 43 graves, though time has worn the markers to near blankness. And if you stand there at dusk, when the mist rises and the crickets fall silent, you might feel it, the weight of history, and the quiet love of two sisters who made a home in the wilds of Kentucky, and gave dignity to strangers when no one else would. In the year 1847, the wild frontier of Kentucky was no place for the faint of heart. The roads were rough tracks carved through endless woods, the nights carried the cries of wolves, and the winters could freeze a man's bones in a single night. Yet, in the heart of that untamed land, a light shone every evening, a warm glow spilling from the windows of the Millbrook Inn. It was not merely the fire that drew people in, it was the women who kept it alive. Margaret and Eliza Cunningham, two sisters bound by blood and a shared dream, were unlike most women of their time. While many frontier women kept their emotions hidden behind rigid manners and the stern laws of survival, the Cunninghams opened their hearts to all who passed their door. Margaret, the elder, carried herself with quiet grace. Her auburn hair was always neatly pinned, her hands steady whether sewing a quilt or ladling out steaming stew. She was the stillness in the storm, the anchor in rough waters, the voice that could calm a frightened child or reassure a desperate traveler. Beside her was Eliza, the younger sister, bright-eyed, quick to laugh, and always ready with a song on her fiddle. Where Margaret offered comfort, Eliza offered joy. Together, they made the Millbrook Inn more than just a resting place. They made it a home on the edge of the wilderness. Wagon trains rolled in along the muddy road, their passengers weary from weeks of travel. Faces pale from hunger, hands calloused from work, eyes clouded with exhaustion. Some had lost loved ones along the way. Others carried the heavy burden of leaving everything behind in search of a better life. The sisters would greet them at the door, Margaret with her steady hands guiding them to the table, Eliza with a laugh that seemed to melt the frost from their bones. The smell of hot stew and fresh bread drifted through the air, wrapping guests in the comfort of a place where no one was a stranger. And as the flames in the hearth danced, the sisters offered something rarer than gold, kindness. Some stayed just one night, warming themselves before moving on toward unknown horizons. Others lingered for weeks, helping in the kitchen, tending to the horses, or sitting on the porch telling stories long into the evening. People came to the Millbrook Inn weary and hollow, and left with fuller bellies, warmer hearts, and memories they would carry for a lifetime. But the frontier was not without its dangers. Sickness traveled faster than the mail, and winter storms could turn the road into a frozen grave. The sisters buried 43 souls over the years, travelers, drifters, pioneers, men, women, and children who had come seeking shelter but met their end before they could move on. The graves lay in a quiet meadow behind the inn, marked not by marble, but by simple wooden crosses. Margaret carved the names when she could, and when no name was known, Eliza would plant wildflowers so that the earth itself would remember them. People whispered that the Millbrook Inn was more than just a stopping place. It was a sanctuary, a beacon of humanity in a world that could be brutally indifferent. Those who survived their journey west often spoke of the sisters in glowing terms. They remembered Eliza's music drifting out into the night, Margaret's gentle voice reading scripture by candlelight, the way the windows glowed like a promise in the dark. In the story of the American frontier, where so much is told of rugged men, fierce battles, and hard survival, the tale of the Cunningham sisters stands apart. It is a story not of conquest, but of compassion. Not of gold rushes or land grabs, but of the quiet heroism of opening a door to the lost and the weary. And so, in that Kentucky inn by the road, love burned in the hearthlight. Season after season, year after year, it warmed the hearts of all who crossed its threshold. Even today, if you walk among the graves behind the Millbrook Inn, you can almost hear the echo of laughter and music on the wind, and you'll know that this was a place where love once lived, fiercely and without condition. The year was 1847. America's western frontier was raw, untamed, and full of promise, but also of danger. Kentucky, though no longer considered the far edge of civilization, still carried the marks of a land shaped by hardship. Dirt roads snaked through rolling hills and deep woods. News traveled slowly. And for travelers pushing westward or merchants returning east, a warm bed and a hot meal could mean the difference between life and death. In the heart of this landscape stood Millbrook Inn, a modest but inviting two-story building nestled near a bend in the road. Its windows glowed warmly on cold nights, and a carved wooden sign swung above the door, creaking in the wind. It was here that the Cunningham sisters, Abigail and Eliza, made their home. They were known for their unmatched hospitality. Fresh bread baked daily, quilts sewn by hand, and a fire always lit in the hearth. They greeted strangers as though they were family. For the weary traveler, Millbrook Inn was more than shelter. It was sanctuary. Hospitality that felt like Love. Abigail was the elder by 5 years, steady and reserved. Eliza was livelier, her laughter carrying down the hallways, her bright eyes quick to notice when someone needed comfort. Together, they created a place where no one felt alone. Farmers bringing grain to market, trappers heading north, soldiers on leave, all found warmth at Millbrook. The sisters had a gift. They didn't just offer a room, they offered a sense of belonging. Lonely men, far from home, often lingered at the inn, drawn by the kindness in Abigail's soft-spoken words or the sparkle in Eliza's smile. But kindness is a dangerous currency in a small town. The whispers began quietly, behind closed doors, in hushed voices on the church steps. Some said the sisters were too friendly, too willing to sit with strangers at the fire, too generous with their time. The inn's reputation began to twist in the mouths of the judgmental. "They're not just serving supper," one farmer muttered to another. "They're inviting trouble." Still, the travelers kept coming. Word spread along the road, Millbrook is a safe place. And for months life at the inn went on unchanged. Until the grave appeared. The first grave. It was spring when someone first noticed it, a fresh mound of earth on the hill behind the inn. A simple wooden cross marked the spot. No name. No date. Just bare wood, already beginning to splinter in the rain. When asked, Abigail only said the man had been passing through, ill beyond saving, and they had buried him with as much dignity as they could. Most accepted the explanation. After all, sickness traveled the roads just as easily as men. But a few kept talking. More graves. Weeks passed. Then came another grave. This time, a local man who had stopped for the night and was never seen again, except for the cross that joined the first on the hill. One grave became 2. 2 became 5. And still, no names. The townsfolk began to avoid the sisters, crossing the street when they saw them. Yet travelers, unaware of the rumors, continued to arrive. By autumn's end, there were 9 graves behind Millbrook Inn. And the hilltop was beginning to look like a small cemetery. The fear that took hold. Some said the sisters were cursed. Others whispered that they were poisoners, luring lonely men into their home only to take their money and lives. No proof was ever shown, but proof wasn't necessary. In a place where superstition ran deep, fear was enough. Yet despite the rumors, no lawmen came. No charges were brought. People died on the frontier. It was a simple fact of life. Accidents, illness, violence, graves were part of the landscape, and so the deaths continued. The 43 graves. By the winter of 1849, the number had risen to 43. 43 wooden crosses standing in the cold wind, the earth beneath them hard as stone. Some graves belonged to strangers no one could name. Others, to locals whose families dared not speak against the sisters aloud, but prayed silently for their souls. The sisters themselves never stopped welcoming guests. Abigail moved more slowly now, her face lined with exhaustion. Eliza smiled less, her eyes shadowed. Still, the hearth was kept warm. The bread was baked. And travelers kept coming. The legend grows. Years passed. The inn eventually closed, the sisters disappearing from the historical record. Some say they moved west. Others claim they rest in unmarked graves beside the very men they buried. Today, the land where Millbrook Inn once stood is empty. But locals still speak of the 43 graves, though no one has found them in decades. On still nights, when the wind moves through the grass, some claim to hear the sound of a woman's voice, soft and welcoming, calling from the darkness. "Come in. You must be tired from the road." And perhaps, in that moment, you'll remember the story of the Cunningham sisters, 2 women who offered love to strangers, and left behind a legend written in whispers and wooden crosses. The year was 1847, And deep in the rolling green hills of Kentucky, where the dusty roads met the quiet stretch of the frontier, stood a place that seemed like a beacon to the weary. The Millbrook Inn. A two-story wooden building, painted white but weathered by rain and wind, its chimneys forever trailing thin ribbons of smoke. It was run by two women, Sisters Cunningham, whose names have faded from most records, but whose kindness is still whispered about in this part of the state. Travelers knew the inn well. Wagons creaked to a stop by the post fence, horses were unhitched and watered, and the tired souls inside would be welcomed by the gentle smiles of the sisters. There was always the smell of bread baking in the kitchen, coffee simmering on the stove, and the warm glow of lamplight spilling from the windows at night. It was not simply a place to rest. It was a place to feel human again, even for a moment, in the midst of the endless miles of dirt road and uncertainty. But this gentle rhythm of frontier life would be tested, shattered by something no one could see and no bullet could stop. By the summer of 1849, whispers began to travel down the same roads that carried the wagons. A sickness was moving through the land. Some swore it was typhoid. Others said cholera. Whatever it was, it seemed to hunt the weary, those whose bodies had been battered by travel, poor food, and worse water. One evening, a young man arrived at the Millbrook Inn. His voice was hoarse, his eyes clouded with fever. He coughed into a handkerchief as the sisters led him upstairs, tucking him into a bed with clean linens. They brought broth, cool water, and pressed wet cloths to his burning skin. But before the rooster crowed the next morning, the young man was gone. He was buried on the hill just beyond the inn, under the shade of a spreading oak. It was a quiet, solemn burial, the sisters bowing their heads as the damp earth closed over him. They could not know that this was the first of many. Within days, another wagon arrived, its driver barely able to hold the reins. The sickness struck quickly. Then another traveler fell ill. Then another. And still, the sisters never turned anyone away. Their days became a blur of fevered whispers, shallow breathing, and the dim light of candles flickering in upstairs rooms. The sound of coughing filled the inn at night, the kind that rattled the chest and seemed to echo in the bones. Some visitors recovered, but many did not. For them, the last thing they saw was the soft glow of the sisters' lamp, and the gentle faces bent over them, offering comfort as life slipped away. By the time the leaves turned in autumn, 8 graves dotted the hill. The sisters dug them side by side, marking each with a simple wooden cross. Some of the dead had names and families. Others were strangers, their origins unknown, their journeys ended far from home. The locals began to call the hill the resting place of the weary. Over the years, more sicknesses came, more winters claimed travelers caught in the cold. By the turn of the next decade, the count of graves rose to 43. Each one told a story, not of the disease that killed them, but of the kindness that tried to save them. Today, if you walk past the ruins of the Millbrook Inn, you might still feel the weight of those stories. The wind sighs through the oak branches. The ground is uneven where the graves lie hidden under time's slow hand. And some say, on a quiet night, a faint light still glows in the place where the sisters kept their lamp, watching over the sick and the dying, refusing to let them leave this world alone. This is the legacy of Sisters Cunningham, a tale not just of death on the frontier, but of compassion in its purest form. In a world where most turned away from the sick for fear of catching the same fate, these two women stood their ground. They gave their hearts, their hands, and perhaps even their own health to those who had nothing left but the hope of a gentle voice and a warm touch. The 43 graves of Millbrook Inn remain a testament, not to tragedy, but to love. And as history fades, the story lives on, a reminder that kindness can outlast even death itself. The year was 1847. The land of Kentucky was a place of wild beauty and quiet danger. Rolling green hills hid deep valleys, and the air carried the scent of pine, damp earth, and something else, something darker. The Millbrook Inn stood on a lonely stretch of road, miles from the nearest town. Travelers came and went, seeking warmth, a hot meal, and a bed for the night. The inn was run by two sisters, Margaret and Eliza Cunningham. Tall, stern, and unfailingly polite, they were known for their kindness towards strangers. No one left the Millbrook Inn without a full belly and a soft place to rest. And yet, as the years passed, a quiet unease began to settle over the countryside. It began with the burials. One by one, the sisters laid people to rest behind the inn. Travelers who had arrived weary and coughing, some clutching their chests, some barely able to speak. The sisters claimed illness had taken them. Cholera, influenza, fevers, words that chilled the blood in an era when medicine was scarce. But no one ever saw the sickness spread in the towns nearby. It seemed to strike only those who stayed under the Cunningham roof. Margaret and Eliza buried each one themselves. No undertaker came. No priest was called to bless the ground. In the silence of the Kentucky dusk, the sisters worked alone, skirts heavy with soil, their hands raw from the shovel's wooden handle. They whispered prayers no one else could hear, their voices barely carried by the wind. The graves were marked with no names, only numbers, carved into small wooden boards. 1 through 43. Each number a life, now gone, unclaimed. The townsfolk grew wary. Some began to whisper over whiskey glasses in the corner of the Millbrook Tavern. "Why so many deaths in one place?" one man muttered. "And why only there?" Others claimed to have heard strange things when riding past the inn at night. A low, mournful singing drifting from the back garden, where the rows of graves lay under the moonlight. Sometimes they saw candlelight flickering between the headstones, as though someone was keeping vigil, or speaking to the dead. Yet when questioned, the sisters had their answers ready. The dead had no kin, they said. The road was dangerous, the winters unforgiving. Illness could strike quickly. They had simply shown mercy where others would have turned away, and so the burials continued. By the end of that long, shadowed decade, the Millbrook Inn had buried more travelers than the town's cemetery. 43 lives ended far from home. 43 numbers, fading slowly under wind and rain. Some say Margaret and Eliza were saints, tending to the lost and forgotten. Others believe the sisters kept a secret far darker than disease, one buried beneath the soil along with those nameless bodies. To this day, the land where the inn once stood is said to be restless. No birds sing there in the morning. The grass grows in uneven patches, as though the earth remembers what lies beneath. And if you stand there at night, with the wind in your ears, some claim you can hear the sisters' voices still, whispering over the graves they dug with their own hands, counting each number, one by one by one. The year was 1847. Kentucky's frontier was a place where hope and hardship walked hand in hand. It was a land where the wild forests met the rolling farmlands, where settlers carved homes from wilderness, and where the sound of wagon wheels often marked the arrival of strangers. On a lonely stretch of road in Millbrook stood an inn, a two-story wooden structure with warm light spilling from its windows, a place of shelter for weary travelers. This was the Millbrook Inn, run by two sisters known simply as the Cunningham sisters. Their names were whispered fondly in nearby towns, for they were women of kindness and unshakable will. They offered hot food to the hungry, a bed to the restless, and often refused payment from those too poor to give it. They called it hospitality. Others called it love. By the year 1851, the inn's graveyard was already a silent witness to tragedy. 43 graves stretched in neat rows behind the building. Some belonged to travelers who had fallen to illness on their journey. Others were locals who had no family to bury them. The Cunninghams had taken it upon themselves to give each a resting place, marked with a simple wooden cross. That winter was like no other. Snow began falling in December and never seemed to stop. By January, the roads were buried in drifts taller than a man. Ice hung thick from the inn's eaves like jagged teeth, and the wind howled through the valleys, carrying with it the sound of cracking branches and distant wolves. The Millbrook Inn became the only safe refuge for miles. Inside, the great stone hearth roared with fire. The smell of stew and bread drifted through the air. The sisters moved quietly, serving tea, tending to the sick, mending torn coats. The rooms were packed with stranded travelers, trappers, merchants, a family with 2 small children, and even a preacher on his way to Frankfurt Point one evening. As the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, a trapper came in from the cold. His face was pale, and snow clung to his fur coat. In a low voice, he told the room what he had seen. "There's movement on the hill," he said, eyes darting toward the frost-covered window. "Shapes in the snow. They bend low, over the graves." The room fell silent. Some scoffed, blaming his story on wind and moonlight. But others, remembering the old whispers about the hill, said nothing. Nights passed. The storm raged on. But several guests claimed they too had seen shadows moving in the moonlight, tall figures gliding between the crosses, pausing as if to dig, or pray. By March, the thaw began. The snow melted in slow, gray rivulets, revealing the earth beneath. That was when they saw at Point 5 new mounds. Freshly turned soil. There had been no burials that winter. No one had seen the sisters carry bodies to the hill. And yet, there they were. Some said it was simply the work of frost and shifting ground. Others whispered that the sisters had not just offered love to the living, but comfort to the dead. That perhaps the lost souls who came to their door never truly left the inn at all. And so, the story of the Millbrook Inn passed into legend. 43 graves. 2 sisters. And a winter when the snow fell endlessly, a season of silence and shadows on the hill. The year was 1853. The little Kentucky settlement of Millbrook lay on the edge of civilization, where the forests whispered secrets, and the wind carried stories no man could quite believe. At the center of the town's most whispered tale stood the Millbrook Inn, a sprawling, weather-worn building run by 2 women, Sisters Eleanor and Margaret Cunningham. For 6 years, their inn had been a place of quiet refuge for weary travelers, drifters, laborers, merchants, and dreamers who crossed the frontier trails seeking fortune or escape. But by now, the hill behind the inn bore a silent testimony to something far darker. 21 graves, each marked with a simple wooden cross, each belonging to someone who had passed through, and never left. It was on an overcast morning, with mist rolling low across the ground, that Sheriff Alden Price rode into Millbrook. His boots were heavy with suspicion before he ever stepped off his horse. For months, rumors had reached him, whispers of death following too close on the heels of hospitality, of strangers arriving at the inn with weary smiles, only to vanish into the earth behind it. The sheriff was no stranger to tragedy. The frontier was a cruel place, swallowing lives without mercy. But this was different. Death had a pattern here. He entered the Millbrook Inn to find the sisters at their work. Eleanor, the elder, stood behind the counter, pouring tea with a calm, unshaken grace. Margaret moved silently through the room, setting out fresh bread and venison stew for the morning's guests. The place smelled of hearthfire and herbs. It looked safe. 21 graves, Sheriff Price said without ceremony. His voice was the kind that could fill a room even when spoken low. "That's a lot of sorrow for one hill." Eleanor looked up, meeting his eyes with a gaze that did not flinch. "These were strangers, Sheriff. They had no one else. We gave them rest." The sheriff studied her face for the twitch of a lie, but found only a stillness that was harder to read than any poker hand. Margaret set down the stew, folding her hands gently. "They came to us sick, weak, alone. No kin to send them home, no preacher to speak over them. We buried them because no one else would." For hours, Sheriff Price asked his questions, turning over every stone of their story. He spoke to the town's doctor, who confirmed each death with a signed certificate. Fever, consumption, pneumonia, the usual killers of the frontier. No wounds. No poison. No cause that smelled of murder. And yet, as the sheriff prepared to mount his horse and leave, his eyes lingered on the hill behind the inn. The crosses stood in 2 neat rows, their wooden arms weathered by wind and rain. The earth there looked freshly turned on one grave, too fresh, perhaps, that he touched the brim of his hat to the sisters, offering no charges, no accusations. But in his mind, a quiet unease took root. As he rode away, the mist swallowed the Millbrook Inn, until only the hill could be seen, its silent markers like sentinels, watching. And the sheriff could not shake the feeling that those 21 graves were not finished being filled. In the year 1847, in the rolling green hills of Kentucky, there stood an inn on the edge of the wilderness, the Millbrook Inn. It was a place of refuge for weary travelers crossing the frontier, a sturdy 2-story building of timber and stone, with smoke curling from its chimney and lamplight spilling warm and golden onto the dusty road. The inn was kept by 2 sisters, Eliza and Margaret Cunningham. They were well known in the county, not only for their beauty and grace but for the strange and almost magnetic kindness they showed to all who crossed their threshold. The sisters had inherited the inn from their late father, and though the land was wild and the road dangerous, they had made it their home. In those days, Kentucky was a land of transition, half-settled farmland mixed with untouched forest, where strangers could vanish without a trace and rumors could travel faster than the mail. The Millbrook Inn stood at a crossroads, an ideal stop for merchants, soldiers, farmers, and wanderers. Each guest was greeted with a warm meal, a soft bed, and the soft, soothing voices of the Cunningham sisters. But as the years passed, whispers began to rise among the locals. It began with a story. A traveling peddler, gaunt, feverish, and pale, stumbled into a nearby tavern one autumn night. His eyes were wide with fear, his voice unsteady as he told his tale. He had spent a night at the Millbrook Inn, taken in by the sisters when sickness had nearly overcome him. They had given him a bed, tended to him with cool cloths, and fed him broth by candlelight. But sometime in the deepest part of the night, he awoke suddenly, without knowing why. The room was dim, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace. And there, standing beside his bed, was Eliza Cunningham. She stood utterly still, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. But in the flickering light, the peddler swore he saw her hands glistening, wet and dark, as though slick with blood. She said nothing, only watched him for a moment before turning and gliding silently from the room. The peddler lay frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. By morning, before the first light of dawn, he gathered his few possessions and fled the inn without a word. He swore never to return, and in the tavern that night, he told anyone who would listen. It didn't take long for the tale to spread. Soon, others claimed to have noticed strange things at the Millbrook Inn, guests who arrived and were never seen again, nighttime movements in the graveyard behind the property, and the faint sound of shovels in the soil after midnight. Most chilling of all was the count. In the small fenced plot behind the inn, there were 43 graves. The sisters explained that they had buried travelers who had died on the road, victims of fever, injury, or the dangers of frontier life. And at first, people believed them. It was, after all, a perilous time. But 43? For a single roadside inn, it seemed too many. Far too many. Still, the sisters stayed. Even as business faltered, as travelers began to choose other lodging, they remained in that lonely place, tending their inn and their garden and their graves. Years passed, and the truth of what happened at the Millbrook Inn was never proven. Were the Cunningham sisters angels of mercy, offering care and burial to the unfortunate? Or was something darker at work, something the frontier would rather whisper about than confront? The inn itself stood until the early 1900s, when it was finally abandoned and left to rot. Today, nothing remains but scattered stones and the small, overgrown cemetery. 43 graves still marked, still standing in the quiet Kentucky grass, and if you stand there at dusk, when the light fades and the wind moves through the trees, some say you might just hear a woman's voice, soft, sweet, and close to your ear, asking if you've come to rest for the night. The year was 1857. The nation was changing rapidly. Kentucky's rolling hills still held the quiet charm of the frontier, but whispers of war and unrest were growing louder across America. Railroads were expanding, industry was creeping into towns, and yet, in the heart of the countryside stood the Millbrook Inn, a place both feared and admired. For a decade, the inn had been run by the Cunningham sisters, Margaret and Eliza. On the surface, they were the picture of Southern hospitality. Travelers passing through were greeted with warm meals, soft beds, and the charm of women who knew exactly what to say to make a guest feel welcome. But beneath that polished civility lay an unsettling shadow, a shadow hinted at by the 43 graves scattered quietly in the field behind the inn. On the night of October 3, 1857, autumn winds rattled the shutters. The night was calm, but the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke. The guests were asleep, the lamps dimmed, and the crackling from the fireplace in the main hall was the only sound, until it wasn't. A spark leapt from the hearth, landing on a loose thread of rug. In moments, flames licked at the walls, racing upward, feeding on the dry timber beams of the old building. The smoke thickened quickly, choking the air. Margaret awoke to the sharp smell and the faint glow of fire outside her bedroom door. Without hesitation, she wrapped her shawl tightly, threw her door open, and ran into the hallway. She shouted for the guests to wake, her voice carrying a strange blend of urgency and authority. "Up! Now! Get to the yard!" she cried, pulling a half-asleep merchant to his feet. In the chaos, her strength seemed almost unnatural, hauling men twice her size, guiding a terrified child down the stairs, even as flames chased them from behind. Eliza, however, was nowhere near the guests. She had slipped into her private quarters, the one room no visitor had ever been allowed to enter. From a chest beneath her bed, she dragged out a trunk wrapped in oilcloth, heavy and clinking faintly inside. She coughed through the smoke, struggling to lift it, but her grip never faltered. Margaret saw her at the doorway and shouted, "Eliza! Leave it!" But Eliza's reply was sharp, cold. "Never." They stumbled out into the chill night air. The guests huddled together in the yard, coughing and trembling. Behind them, the Millbrook Inn roared like an angry beast, flames clawing at the night sky. But Eliza's eyes were not on the fire, they were on the trunk at her feet. When at last the blaze was contained, too late to save much of the inn, the sisters retreated to the back of the property. There, in the faint glow of the embers, Eliza unlocked the trunk. Inside was a bundle of papers, tied neatly with twine. These were not just financial records, they were ledgers of every traveler who had stayed at the inn. Each name was listed with meticulous notes, arrival date, the nature of their visit, and chillingly, in some cases, details of their deaths. Many of the names matched the unmarked graves behind the inn. The fire was publicly blamed on a stray ember, a tragic accident on a cold night. No one questioned the official story. The guests who survived spoke of the sisters' heroism, how Margaret had risked her life to save them, how Eliza had guarded something important to the family business. Within months, the inn was rebuilt, larger, sturdier, and more imposing than before. And though the walls were new, the graves remained, their number growing quietly, year by year. The Great Fire had changed nothing. If anything, it had strengthened the legend. The Cunningham sisters endured, their charm intact, their secrets hidden, for now. And behind that rebuilt facade, the Millbrook Inn continued its quiet work, offering love, comfort, and perhaps something much darker, to those who came seeking shelter. The wind always seemed to whisper through the hills of Millbrook, Kentucky. It carried with it the faint scent of wood smoke, river water, and something else, something older. The land had seen hardship before. Harsh winters, failed harvests, hungry mouths. But in 1847, the story of the Millbrook Inn began, not as just a stop for weary travelers, but as the setting for one of Kentucky's most haunting legends. Two sisters, Eleanor and Margaret Cunningham, stood at the heart of it. Tall, graceful, and sharp-eyed, they ran the Millbrook Inn with quiet dignity. They were known for their warm meals, clean rooms, and the strange comfort they seemed to offer anyone who crossed their threshold. Visitors, whether traders, farmers, or frontier scouts, spoke of the sisters as angels of the road. But the frontier was not a gentle place. The inn sat at a crossroads, a vital artery for travelers heading west. Some came with gold dreams in their eyes. Others fled debts or the law. All carried stories. The sisters listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes frowning, but they never turned anyone away. Even the desperate and dangerous found a meal waiting in the kitchen. Then came 1861. War split the nation, and Kentucky found itself torn in two. Union blue and Confederate gray marched across the same roads, drank from the same wells, and slept beneath the same roofs. And so it was that Millbrook Inn became more than a haven. It became a place where enemies crossed paths under the same roof. The soldiers came in pairs, in ragged groups, or sometimes alone, their boots heavy with mud, their rifles clattering against the walls. Eleanor would greet them at the door, calm and unshaken. Margaret would usher them to the hearth, ladling thick stew into bowls. The sisters asked no questions, at least none out loud, but not everyone who checked in would leave. Rumors began to stir in nearby towns. Some said the Cunninghams were spies for the Union, hiding Confederate deserters in the attic until patrols passed. Others swore they aided the South, slipping food and shelter to the gray coats in the dead of night. And there were darker tales still. Whispers claimed that soldiers who threatened the sisters never made it out alive. They spoke of poisoned wine, of heavy boots climbing the stairs and never coming down, of the hill behind the inn, where freshly turned soil seemed to appear after every storm. By 1865, when the war's final shots faded into memory, the quiet hill above Millbrook Inn held 35 graves. Some were marked with rough wooden crosses. Others were left bare, the grass growing thick and unbroken over the earth. The locals avoided the hill, saying the air was too still there, as if even the wind dared not linger. The sisters never admitted to anything. When asked about the graves, Eleanor would only say, "War leaves many without a home. We give them one." Margaret would turn her gaze away, her lips pressed into a thin, unbroken line. Years later, travelers passing through still found the inn standing, its timbers weathered but strong. The sisters grew older, their hair turning silver, but they still welcomed anyone who came knocking, be it a merchant, a wanderer, or a stranger whose eyes held shadows of the past. And yet, the hill behind the inn continued to grow. By the time the last Cunningham sister was laid to rest, there were 43 graves beneath the grass. 43 silent witnesses to a story no one could fully tell. Today, the Millbrook Inn stands empty. Its windows are dark, its doors long shut. But those who walk past swear they hear the faint clink of dishes, the murmur of women's voices, and the slow, steady creak of boots on the stairs. Some claim to see 2 figures in the upstairs window, watching, waiting, still offering a strange kind of welcome to any soul who dares to cross their path. Because here, in this forgotten corner of the Kentucky frontier, love and danger once shared the same table, and the earth behind the inn still holds the secrets of the Sisters Cunningham. In the heart of Kentucky, where the rolling hills once met the untamed edge of the American frontier, there stood a place both welcoming and haunted, the Millbrook Inn. Built in 1847, during a time when the land was still wild and travelers were more likely to meet danger than comfort, this inn became a rare sanctuary for those passing through. It was run by 2 remarkable women, the Cunningham sisters, Eleanor and Margaret. In a time when most women were confined to quiet domestic lives, these sisters chose a different path. They opened their doors to strangers, wanderers, soldiers, and settlers making their way west. They didn't just offer a bed and a meal, they offered kindness, warmth, and something rare on the frontier: love for the weary soul. Yet, behind its glowing windows and hearty meals, the Millbrook Inn had another story to tell, one whispered in the night, one that travelers carried with them after they left. Because on the hillside behind the inn, 43 graves slowly grew in number, each marked with a weathered wooden cross or simple stone. Some were victims of sickness. Some were poor travelers who never made it to their destination. Others, well, their deaths were harder to explain. And then came the night that would forever etch itself into the legend of Millbrook. It was the autumn of 1868. A storm tore through the countryside, the kind of storm that made the old windows rattle and turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. The wind howled through the trees like a warning. Just after sundown, the sisters heard the slow, deliberate clop of horse hooves on the muddy path. A figure appeared out of the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of a black hat, a long black coat draped over him like a shroud. He asked for a room in a voice so low and gravelly that Eleanor almost didn't catch the words. She noticed he carried no visible luggage, only a leather satchel that he kept close at all times. For the next 3 nights, the stranger in black barely spoke. He took his meals at the far corner table, eyes scanning the room as though measuring every soul who entered. Margaret swore she felt his gaze follow her whenever she crossed the floor, but what struck the sisters most was that he never seemed to sleep. Long after midnight, when the lamps were dimmed and the guests had gone to bed, one of them would glimpse him sitting in the common room, staring into the fire, the satchel at his feet. On the 4th morning, silence hung over the inn. His room door was still shut. When Eleanor knocked, there was no answer. Inside, they found him lying perfectly still on the bed, eyes closed, face calm, as though he had simply drifted away in the night. But there was something unsettling about the scene. His satchel was gone. Every trace of his belongings, gone. By the time the sheriff arrived, there was nothing left to examine, no clue to who he was, where he had come from, or what had brought him to Millbrook Inn. The Cunningham sisters buried him on the hill behind the inn, in what became grave number 36. No name. No date beyond that stormy October. To this day, locals still wonder, was he a fugitive running from the law? A man with dangerous secrets? Or perhaps someone carrying something so valuable, someone else had a reason to make sure he never left Millbrook alive. Travelers say that on nights when the wind howls across those Kentucky hills, you can still see a tall man in black standing at the edge of the inn's porch, waiting, watching, as though he's still searching for something he left behind. The story of the Cunningham sisters and their 43 graves is not just a tale of mystery. It's a reminder of the fragile line between kindness and danger on the old frontier. In a place where every traveler had a past, and every past had shadows, sometimes the most welcoming door could lead to the most haunting of memories. And grave number 36 remains the most whispered about of them all. The year was 1847. The frontier was a living, breathing promise, a land of unbroken wilderness and untamed opportunity. The dusty trails of Kentucky were busy with families pushing westward, their wagons loaded with dreams, their hearts pounding with hope and fear in equal measure. And there, along one of those worn wagon roads, stood the Millbrook Inn. It was a modest 2-story wooden building, framed by the tall, whispering trees of the rolling Kentucky hills. The sign above the door, carved by hand, simply read, Millbrook. But those who traveled the trail knew its reputation. Behind its doors lived the Cunningham sisters, Mary and Eliza. They were not wealthy women. They had no family left of their own. What they did have was kindness, and a determination to treat every stranger who came to their door as if they were kin. To some, they offered warm bread and stew. To others, they offered a bed in the loft, thick quilts to guard against the chill. But to the most desperate, they offered something far more valuable: care, without condition. In those early years, visitors often arrived with more than road dust on their boots. They brought fevers, chills, and the mysterious sicknesses that stalked the frontier. Doctors were scarce in the hills. Medicine was crude. More often than not, it was the gentle hands of the Cunningham sisters that became the only hope for the ailing. But the frontier was not forgiving. By the winter of 1849, the first grave appeared on the hill behind the inn. A wagon driver, feverish, delirious, and far from home, had taken his last breath under the sisters' roof. The sisters buried him themselves on the frost-hardened slope, marking the spot with a wooden cross. They never knew his real name. The years rolled on, and so did the tragedies. Typhoid, cholera, the dreaded marsh fever that seemed to drift up from the lowlands. Sickness came in waves, sweeping away travelers before they could reach their promised land. One by one, the graves multiplied. Each mound told the story of a journey that had ended too soon. By 1865, the Civil War had left its shadow even in this quiet place. Wounded soldiers, both Union and Confederate, staggered in from the road. Some survived on the sisters' broth and bread. Others did not. The hill grew crowded. The crosses stood like silent sentinels over the dead, some carved with names, many more with only the word traveler. Then came the year 1871, and the final tragedy that sealed Millbrook Inn's place in history. It was a cold autumn evening when a family of 5 arrived. A father, a mother, and 3 children, all pale, exhausted, their wagon creaking under the weight of their belongings. They were bound for Missouri, chasing the promise of a new start. But they were too late in the season, and the journey had already worn them thin. Within 2 days, the youngest child was shivering with fever. The doctor from the nearest town came and shook his head. "Marsh fever," he said gravely. "I can try, but it takes who it wants." The sisters did everything they knew: cool cloths, warm broth, whispered prayers. But the fever moved like fire. One by one, the family slipped away. By the 7th day, all 5 lay silent in the cold. The Cunningham sisters buried them together, under one wide mound on the crowded hill. That mound brought the total to 41 graves. 2 more, in the months that followed, would make it 43. After that, no more. It is said the sisters never turned away another traveler, but something changed in them after that autumn. Their hair grew silver. Their laughter faded. And when Mary passed in 1883, followed by Eliza 2 years later, the inn's door closed for good. Today, the Millbrook Inn is gone, swallowed by weeds and time. But the hill remains. 43 graves, most unmarked, lie beneath the grass. Locals say that on still nights, if you stand at the edge of the hill and listen, you can hear the sound of footsteps on the inn's old wooden floors, and the faint rustle of quilts being drawn up over weary shoulders. The frontier was built on dreams. But here, on this quiet hill in Kentucky, it's the lost voices of the travelers, and the love of 2 sisters who never let them die alone, that remain. If you want, I can also make a cinematic narration version with timed pauses, emotional peaks, and visuals so it's ready to record for YouTube. That would give your video a deep, haunting storytelling flow. The year was 1847, deep in the rolling hills of Kentucky, where the dusty trail met the river's bend. The Millbrook Inn had once been a place of warm welcomes, a beacon for weary travelers crossing the unpredictable American frontier. Back then, 2 sisters, Margaret and Eliza Cunningham, had made it more than just an inn. They had made it a home. For decades, they welcomed strangers with bread still warm from the oven, coffee strong enough to keep a wagon driver awake through the night, and a kindness that made even the loneliest souls linger. Every guest was treated like family. Every bed was prepared with care, But by 1847, things had changed. Margaret, the elder sister, grew frail. Her once steady hands now trembled when she poured the coffee. The sparkle in her eyes faded into something quieter, more distant. Eliza, younger but burdened by years of care, found her hair turning white before her time. The laughter that had once filled the halls of Millbrook was now just an echo. The town, once fond of the sisters, began to avoid them. Whispers traveled faster than stagecoaches. People spoke of misfortune, and of the 43 graves that lay just beyond the orchard behind the inn. Graves marked by crooked wooden crosses, most without names. Some claimed they belonged to travelers who had simply fallen ill and passed away on their journeys. Others murmured darker tales, that those who stayed too long at the inn never truly left. But the sisters never spoke of the graves. They only tended them, year after year, in silence. By why that winter, no one dared stay the night. Passing travelers would glance toward the Millbrook Inn and see the light of a single candle flickering in the window, but they kept their wagons moving. The air around the inn felt colder, heavier, as though the land itself carried the weight of sorrow. Still, Margaret and Eliza kept the fire burning. Every evening, they prepared a room. They laid fresh linen on the bed, even though no footsteps came up the front steps anymore. It was as if they were waiting for one last guest who might never arrive. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The rain pounded the roof. The wind howled through the shutters like a chorus of lost souls. And yet, in the dim light of the parlor, Eliza sat knitting by the fire, while Margaret dozed in her rocking chair. The inn creaked and groaned, its old timbers aching under the weight of the years. Some say a knock came at the door that night. Just once, firm and deliberate. Others swear there was no knock at all, only the wind. But by morning the fire had burned out. The sisters were gone. The townsfolk found the inn silent, its doors unlocked, the tables set for breakfast that was never eaten. Upstairs, the beds were perfectly made. Down by the orchard, the 43 graves now numbered 4-5. This day, no one knows who dug those last two. And on foggy nights, when the wind sweeps through Millbrook, locals say you can see a faint glow in the inn's upstairs window, as if two sisters are still waiting, keeping the fire alive for a guest who will never come. In the fading light of Kentucky's rolling hills, there once stood a small wooden inn that was more than just a place for weary travelers to rest. It was a haven, a refuge, and for some, an eternal home. The Millbrook Inn first opened its doors in 1847, run by two sisters whose names would be whispered in both gratitude and curiosity for decades, Margaret and Eliza Cunningham. They had come to this lonely patch of frontier land with nothing but a few trunks of clothing, a cast iron stove, and a fierce determination to carve out a life in a world that had little patience for women living on their own. The Cunninghams weren't like other innkeepers. They didn't just provide a bed and a meal. They offered kindness to anyone who crossed their threshold. Travelers spoke of the warmth of the fire in the hearth, the scent of fresh cornbread drifting from the kitchen, and the soft voices of the sisters as they sat at the long pine table, listening to stories from strangers as though each one mattered deeply. But the frontier was unforgiving. Winter storms cut off supply lines. Sickness rode in with the change of seasons. Roads brought drifters, some kind and desperate, others cruel and dangerous. Yet, no matter who came, the sisters never turned anyone away, and so, the hill behind the inn began to change. At first, just one grave. A traveler who had fallen ill, too far from his family to be taken home. The sisters dug into the earth themselves, set a simple wooden cross, and laid him to rest. That was the first. Years passed, and more travelers came through, many never left. Accidents, fevers, and the perils of the road claimed them. Every burial was done with care. Each grave was marked with a cross, sometimes with just a single letter carved into the wood. Over the decades, the number of graves grew. Locals began to call the place the 40 Graves of Millbrook, though no one kept exact count, except the Sisters. By 1875, time had left its mark on Margaret Cunningham. Her hair had turned silver, her hands stiff from years of work. That spring, she passed quietly in her sleep, wrapped in the same quilt she had used since their first winter on the frontier. Eliza buried her at the far edge of the hill, where the land sloped gently toward the river. On the cross, she carved only a single letter, M. It was grave number 42.3 months later, in the heat of summer, the townsfolk stopped by to check on Eliza. They found her sitting in her favorite rocking chair on the porch, eyes closed, hands folded neatly in her lap. She was gone. No struggle, no sign of pain, just a peaceful departure, as if she had followed her sister's footsteps without hesitation. The people of Millbrook buried her beside Margaret. This time, they carved her full name into the cross. It was grave number 40-3. In the years after, the inn fell silent. The roof caved in, the shutters rotted, and the road that once brought life to its door grew over with weeds. But the hill remained. 43 simple graves, most with only a single letter. No one knows all their names. No one knows all their stories. Some say that on quiet nights, if you stand on that hill, you can still hear the faint creak of a rocking chair from the porch that no longer stands. Others claim to smell the scent of fresh cornbread drifting on the wind, as though the sisters are still welcoming weary souls to a place where love, even in death, is freely given. The 43rd grave wasn't just Eliza Cunningham's resting place. It was the end of an era, when two women, in the harshest reaches of the Kentucky frontier, gave everything they had to strangers, and asked for nothing in return. And though the Millbrook Inn is gone, the land remembers. And so do we. In the rolling hills of Kentucky, where the fog clings low to the grass in the early morning and the wind carries whispers through the tall oak trees, there once stood an inn like no other. It was the year 1847, a time when the Kentucky frontier was both promise and peril, a place where travelers faced endless miles of wilderness, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of danger. It was here, along a lonely dirt road near what is now Millbrook, that two sisters, Eleanor and Margaret Cunningham, built their modest yet inviting home. Locals called it the Millbrook Inn, though it was never grand in the sense of chandeliers or polished marble. Instead, its walls were warm with the glow of lantern light, the smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen, and the laughter of the sisters welcomed weary travelers. Eleanor, the elder, was known for her sharp mind and strong spirit. She could negotiate with traders, fix a wagon wheel, and still make the best stew in 3 counties. Margaret, softer in manner but no less capable, had a gift for music. Her voice could still the restless heart of any stranger. Together, they created a haven in the wild, where those passing through found shelter, comfort, and perhaps something more. For years, the Millbrook Inn became a vital stop for settlers heading west, soldiers traveling home, and peddlers seeking rest. But as with all frontier stories, the peace did not last. Rumors began to swirl through the small towns, whispers of guests who had stayed at the inn and never reached their destination. Some said it was bandits on the road. Others hinted that the danger might lie closer, within the very walls that promised safety. The truth has long been buried, but what is known is this: by the early 1860s, the inn had gained a darker reputation. Some visitors swore they had seen the sisters digging late at night on the hill behind the house. Others claimed to hear muffled cries in the wind. And yet people still came. Whether drawn by desperation, by the charm of the sisters, or perhaps by forces they could not explain, the Millbrook Inn never stood empty. When the Civil War tore through Kentucky, tragedy struck. The inn was raided one night, some say by Union soldiers, others by desperate Confederate deserters. Fires were set, shots rang out, and in the chaos, Eleanor and Margaret vanished. The Millbrook Inn burned to the ground. When the smoke cleared, only the stone foundation remained. But what was left behind was far more chilling. On the hill behind the ruins, 43 freshly dug graves were found, each marked only by a simple wooden cross. No records were kept of who they were, soldiers, travelers, or victims of some older, darker truth. Some believed the sisters buried those who died on the road, giving them peace when no one else would. Others were convinced these were the final resting places of those who had entered the inn and never left alive. Over the years, the story became a legend in the Kentucky hills. Farmers spoke of seeing two women in faded 19th-century dresses wandering among the graves at dusk, as if tending to their eternal guests. Hunters claimed to hear the faint sound of a piano drifting through the trees, though no instrument stood within miles. Travelers passing the hill on moonlit nights said they felt an unseen presence, not threatening, but heavy, watching. Today, nothing remains of the Millbrook Inn except the crumbling foundation stones, half swallowed by grass and moss. Yet on the hill, the 43 graves remain, untouched by time, hidden among wildflowers, and so the legend of the Sisters Cunningham endures. Were they saints of the frontier, offering love and comfort to the lost? Or was their hospitality touched by something darker, a hunger that could not be sated? We may never know. But in the heart of Kentucky, as the sun dips below the hills and the wind carries the faint notes of an old song, some still believe the sisters are there, waiting to welcome travelers to their eternal inn. Because on the frontier, love and danger often walked hand in hand, and some stories never truly end.